A German theologian walks into the Trump era and writes a devotional about the Weimar Republic and the parallels between that time and ours. And this is not the setup to a joke. It's Hanna Reichel's attempt to help Christians navigate the rising authoritarianism we face in America today without getting swept away by fear, rage, or the temptation to retreat into purity politics. Plus, as a theology nerd, when a systematic theologian writes a devotional, you receive it in the mail, read it, and, it actually enabled you to get devotional. You go, wow, eureka! Whew. How exactly does a theologian write a devotional and it's good? I'm not going to name names of all those who have attempted such task and failed, but I am going to introduce you to Hanna, who did an amazing job. And this book is available right now for you to use personally. It's an amazing text to use for a conversation with a small group or a friend group. And if you want to hang out with Hanna, then go check out Princeton Theological Seminary, where they work, or get yourself a copy for such a time as this, an emergency devotional. Here we go, friends. It's time to nerd out with your geek out, but don't forget, the best brew is a shared brew. So, share it. Well, hello, everyone. This is Trip. Hanna is back on the podcast doing something theologians aren't, at least, lured into on a regular basis, writing a devotional. So what's up with that? A systematic theologian writing a devotional.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me again. After writing a very different book from the last one, I really enjoyed our conversation then. But what is similar with this book is it also just kind of happened. I didn't really plan for it. In my sense, right, systematic theology is not necessarily about, as we know, system building and all that right stuff. It's about trying to make sense of things that don't necessarily cohere without much effort, right? It's trying to hold things in tension and draw out the lines between them that we have a hard time wrapping our mind around. That's not so different from a kind of devotional practice, maybe, but it can be, obviously, in most of its real life iterations. It's quite different. But yeah, it just so happened that earlier this year when, suddenly there was a lot of stuff happening in the world and in this country in particular, and I found myself doom scrolling a lot and spiraling a lot and going on my runs a lot and just trying to process everything that was happening, that I fell into this different mode of trying to think through it.
Well, I don't think the different format changed how compelling and provocative it is. And one of the elements that runs through it are these parallels between our current political climate in the United States and the Weimar Republic in Germany a century ago. And I wonder, a lot of times there are hyperbolic analogies, and then there are it's not that bad, don't use any of that language, temper it down. This isn't the rise of the Nazi Party. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about the similarities and dissimilarities and why that historical comparison is still relevant, even if not, perfectly analogous.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And partially, I also feel I wish I could have written a different book with a different kind of background, and I hope other people do that, right? For example, I really wish our Latin American friends, liberation theologians, now write a book where they're basically your CIA came in and destroyed our democracies, but now we have these awesome practices that we've come up with, and here we're here ready to share them with you now that you need them too, right? So that type of thing. Obviously, the kind of comparison between Nazi Germany or even Weimar Germany and then Trump started relatively early in his first presidency. We've had a lot of commentators talk about his rhetoric and some of the stuff that was going on at the rallies and some of the ways that he was catering to kind of white supremacists in the background. And there was a lot of concern about that really early on. And in the meantime, right, where we are now, it's arguably has gotten a lot worse. So, the parallels, not all of them are strictly hyperbolic. Obviously, the political theorists can argue more closely about, where are we on the scale between kind of authoritarianism, totalitarianism, full-blown fascism? We definitely see a lot of elements of authoritarianism. I think that is true. Will we end up with concentration camps? Hopefully not, right? But there are lots of parallels even before we have kind of the full scale Nazi analogy going. But yeah, I think in some ways it works. In some ways, it often where it's used. Sometimes it's used with a lot of analytical traction and discretion, right? There are specific things that we point out in the policy and in the rhetoric and in the kind of emotional stuff that's going on inside and how that's being harnessed by propaganda and leveraged into resentment and so forth. We can do analyses of these types of things. A lot of times the Nazi analogy gets used in a kind of rhetorical strategic sense, right? Basically, these are the bad guys, and we are now reassured that we're the good guys who are kind of resisting whatever this is. And I think that actually has a lot of dangers. I wanna resist that one as much as I can, and partially actually because of the historical wisdom, right? I mean, if you have actually, as you have, and as many of your readers have studied a bit about 20th century German history, I mean, one of the things that stands out is like if you're in the middle of it, it's actually quite murky, right? There are the full blown monsters of history, yes, but both on the monster side, there are also the bystanders and the people who just care about their families and their own advancement or just don't think too much. The kind of banality of evil stuff that Hannah Arendt points out, even for such a prominent and like high level case as Eichmann. And on the other side, also on the side of the resistance, right? I mean, in the Christian context, often the confessing church, it's so murky, right? Like many of the people who actually convened at Barmen were party members of the National Socialist Democratic Party. Many of them came together because they were mostly concerned about the state overstepping in church politics. We all know that they didn't manage to kind of get consensus even on like naming, right, what was starting to happen to the Jews, let alone like resistance practically or even in the documents. So part of what I'm trying to do is kind of to thread the needle between the situation is really dramatic. In some ways it's really dramatic. And on the other hand, life goes on, and kind of most of the trick is trying to find these moments within the everyday of life where it's like, no, it does make a difference to now do this rather than that, right? Like, and drawing inspiration from a history where we know that there's like full-blown evil afoot. And at the same time, a lot of the resistance that was happening was not the grandiose one. It's not the type of thing that you make movies about, but it's pencil pushers pushing pencils slightly slower, right? And sometimes that helps people to survive. And people realizing that you might not have this full-blown, pristine political alliance against evil that you want, but you have people who come together for all kinds of different motives, and you need to be able to work with who's there and with what you have, and to try to make do with that, and to kind of actually kind of leverage some of the murkiness more than kind of the high contrast vision that sometimes the Nazi vision provides. The analogy provides, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I actually think that's one of the best things about this book. I've already recommended it to a number of friends and told clergy, oh, you should use this. And part of it is precisely that the muddy murkiness of all the different kinds of responses in the German context, which if people haven't listened to the previous episode, that's you're from Germany. So it's not just like you happen to know the history, you've lived and are, and we're a part of the church there and such, that all the different kinds of responses give a texture for this text that is both, prophetic in the sense that it's calling something out of the church and calling us to discipleship, but it also recognizes, the ecosystem of resistance and the stages in which consciousness gets formed, and the different kind of devotional selections can raise different elements of it. It allows a community or the individual doing it alone to wrestle with themselves where they are rather than beat themselves up with, oh, well, I'm not Bonhoeffer, and you're like, okay, well, congrats. Like there was one of them and he's not here and this isn't there. But there's something about that witness, or what you talk about Bart, or all the complexities of the confessing church. At the beginning, you draw a distinction where you make a joke about quibbling about terms and definitions between the rise of authoritarianism and emerging totalitarianism. And I wonder if you could kind of unpack that a bit, because I think the distinction that's going on there is helpful for understanding the context for discipleship.
Yeah, thanks. So, just one quick comment, because you said, yes, my background is I lived in Germany. I grew up there. Some of my scholarship has also been on Bart and the confessing church, and his own activity of like doing theology in a mode of confession. So it's both kind of my biographical background and scholarly background. And I'm leveraging it because of that, right? Because it's the stuff I know best. As I said earlier, I think people need to leverage all kinds of different resources precisely because it's so easy, when you're in the middle of whatever this is that we're currently in, to think, oh, this is all right. It's unprecedented. Everything is happening so fast. Everything is so dramatic. Then you kind of start feeling overwhelmed and completely unable to respond, and to instead lean back and say, okay, actually, most moments of history, in most comments, in most contexts, were not like I don't know if most of your readers kind of prize liberal democracy in a pluralistic society as kind of the vision of, whatever, close to the kingdom of God. Maybe not, but right, like in whatever sort of functioning system, but most times we're actually much more murky than that. And to basically say, right, like if things are dramatic and if we don't know what the future looks like, and if we have to be afraid even for our lives, and certain communities obviously much more than others, then that's actually not new. That is something that people have experienced before. And so let's lean into the wisdom that they have. And I'm just leaning into mine. The difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism, obviously, like, yeah, political theorists might draw the distinction slightly differently. But one of the things that I see recurrently is kind of authoritarianism is kind of a leader or kind of a central government trying to get ever more power. But most people can continue living their lives more or less as they want to, as long as they kind of conform to that as like, this is what is important, right? Like you have to demonstrate a certain kind of loyalty. You have to give a certain kind of deference. But if you do that, then you can kind of also, you have like significant liberty in your daily life. And totalitarianism really is kind of reserved for that case where that is no longer the case, where actually the system that is in place really works by trying to exert total grasp on people's lives, right? And that's the term, totalitarianism. So it's not just there's a political agenda that needs to be pushed through, and if that works, then, or there's a particular leader and they want a particular type of worship, and as long as they get that, there's room for negotiation. But it's basically all areas of life must come under the control of whatever this ideology is. It's often one of a certain national strength, of a certain purity also, that then needs to kind of excise foreign elements, whether ideological or in whatever physical form. But the totalitarianism kind of extends not just even to like people going along and doing what the regime wants, but it extends to their thoughts and feelings, right? It wants you to love Big Brother, or at least to fear Big Brother. And this was actually one of the things that gave me maybe the most pause, right, in the early days of this second Trump administration, as we saw this slew of executive orders issuing. And many of them were fully frightening in and of themselves. But at the same time, kind of this meta policy, right, of, as Steve Bannon said, like flooding the zone with shit, and this whole like flood of this onslaught of things that were happening that almost seemed, geared to engender, probably not almost, like probably designed to engender fear and a sense of inevitability and of being swept up. And where you kind of see, so one of the things that is happening is there are certain policies that get pushed through, but the other thing is they want you to be in shock and awe. They want you to be afraid. They want you to feel like you have no power. And once you start believing that, right, that actually, like, that's one of the things that they want. So let's not give them that, at least.
Yeah. The other day, my oldest, who this summer we spent a week in Berlin when I was teaching a class at Bonhoeffer's house. So, that sets up having conversations and when we're in Berlin doing like the tour in the downtown of like where the big moments happen, the Reichstag fire. And he jokes, he's like, we would be really sad if later when people are giving a tour of Washington, D.C., they go, and here's where Big Balls was carjacked.
Yeah.
And that's when we nationalized the guard and put masks on cops and had them all run around. And he's like, that just doesn't sound nearly as cool as Reichstag fire. But
yeah.
No, Big Balls got carjacked, and he used to be on Doge.
Yeah, but this is another one of the parallels that is actually kind of so uncanny, right? Because it's so obvious that states of emergencies are engineered. There are certain things that one can talk about. How bad is what type of crime indeed in which inner city, or how bad is which situation in which Mexican cartel or whatever, where there might be two areas of concern. But the way they get leveraged into yes, this is an emergency, and now this demands emergency measures, is precisely, right, what allowed Hitler just kind of take over. And this is not the only thing. This is something that many authoritarian leaders do, is kind of engineer threats all the time, right? Engineer threats that then necessitates more power to the central leader to kind of combat them, and also like maybe whip up some sort of sense of unity, right, around whatever the threat is. Often, especially when it gets projected either on, the foreigners here in this country. I mean, immigrants obviously are once more scapegoated in this way specifically, but also minorities within, trans people, the big scare. We get more bills against trans people in college sports than there probably are trans people in college sports, where whatever the threat is, if there is a threat, mostly becomes a kind of hook for that kind of power grasp and an emotional politics.
You see that whole engineering of threats, and it seems that the other element of it that you point out in the book is that there's like the external threat, and then there's the cultivating of internal resentment, and the way that like the external threat and one's internal resentments get harnessed by this leader who occupies, right, this state of the exception, or whatever way we want to talk about it, and that space of how we navigate our relationship to our family, our friends, our role in vocations, our relationship to the state and political participation, all that gets reformed when even those who, seek to kind of resist these moves carry with us resentment and let the fear of the authoritarian cripple us. And I wonder, like, what part did those challenges play in making a rather timely and urgent theological piece a devotional? Right, like that you chose a devotional says something about how you see the Christian life, the life of faith, and I wonder if you could kind of let us in to that framework, like how this is a devotional is how you understand that theologically, addressing anyone that would read it, their own kind of like selfhood, subjectivity, or way of being in the world.
Yeah, thanks. I love this question, and I think when I first started doing it, I wasn't really aware. I started reflecting on it later, but I think this is really a big part of it, right? So as I was sitting in this own sense of being swept away and like feeling all the doom, and maybe also have kind of a personal inclination to like, oh, this is all very dramatic, and to both know on a theoretical level that this is actually, counterproductive, and to also feel existentially, no, this is wrong. This is the thing that should not be happening. And then to kind of realize a big portion of what the life of faith has always been about that certain reorientation, right? So grounding ourselves in the spiritual practice, reorienting ourselves to say God first and then the world, is not withdrawing. It is not saying all of this is not relevant. It is kind of a gaining space almost, right? And a kind of like, I feel like physically reorienting. I know there are some these famous pietists who say you have to convert twice, right? You have to convert to God and then back to the world. And I feel like you need this double movement to gain also this range of motion and this freedom to kind of then come back to where you are in the world and do something productive about it rather than just being swept up in it. And so, in terms of the history and the politics, to know, right, this is a lot of the politics that have to do with creating fear, creating anger, creating resentment, and harnessing it. And this is also another one of the areas where there's so interesting parallels between the Weimar Republic, where you have a whole nation that came out of a war that they had, started and also lost, and then were made to pay brutal reparations for. And then, like, at the level of, the everyday people, you have a lot of resentment, a lot of the feeling of like, oh yeah, these powers fucked us over. What am I allowed to say this on show? Yeah, sorry. Like, we got screwed here, and now our economy is in shambles. Now I can't get a job. Now I can't feed my family. Like, there's a lot of this that can get leveraged so easily then by this guy who comes in and basically promises you to make the nation great again and to like smite all your enemies and to really show them, right, and to pay back. And so that kind of pivots into a kind of nationalism and very aggressive form of new militaristic expansion, where maybe you could have learned from this other war, right? That was not a good idea in the first place. But that's not what happens when we get swept up in our emotions. And so, or when demagogues hook into them, right? So part of what I'm trying to do in the devotional is like structurally, this is very traditional fit. It's very, very like ancient structure. It has this 4-part structure that like many of the traditional liturgies have. Of course, there's a kind of gathering where you also arrive and take inventory. And this is many of the lessons in this beginning phase start with, so take stocks. Like, what is it that you're feeling? Where are you feeling this in your body? What is happening here? And you should really make space for all these feelings, because if we don't attend to them, they just fester. But also, we don't necessarily need to trust all our feelings. And we also don't need to act on all our feelings. And we get to have some sort of discretion what we do with them, and to kind of use these ancient practices of liturgy of even, these prayers at the beginning, of kind of handing some of that over to God, of getting reoriented, of confessing, right? This is where I am. This is what I feel. This is what I want to do. But then opening up the space for listening and responding, for gathering in prayer, in community, in the Eucharist. And then at the end, being kind of sent out again into widening circles of there's an importance to close-knit communities, to being with people, who you feel safe with, who you think alike, who you can share joys and pains with, and like also like potentially actually pray together for those of us who do that. And you can stay there, right? Like, this is a temptation to build the temple on the hill. This is where Jesus say, "Get thee behind me, Satan." You kind of need to get back from the mountain and go back into the world and get back with the people you don't necessarily agree with, and you at least feel uncomfortable with. And I'm not telling anyone they need to be unsafe, but right, like, if we just stay in our own little enclaves of shared understanding and try to weather the storm, we will also not really be able to do much about it. So I think at the end, this is a very important element, even in the liturgic practice, right? Like, this is to strengthen you for the journey. This is so that you can get back out there.
In part one, one of the things you spend some time kind of dwelling on is the way in which the Nazi movement was skilled at harnessing our emotions, things like fear and humiliation, resentment, rage. And it was connected to that move for consolidating power and undermining democracy. And in chapter 3, you bring up Karl Barth's advice to deprive them of their pathos, and is kind of a strategic approach to political emotions. So I wonder if you can help us think how individuals test their feelings to prevent them from being leveraged by ideologues. And like, I don't know, what does it mean for feelings to disguise themselves as other feelings or as thoughts, which is a great line, a kind of Barth giving advice on what to do with the false consciousness of the pressure of kind of creeping authoritarianism.
Yeah, and the deprive them of their pathos is it's from the Romans commentary. I think Arne Rasmussen picked up on it first, and then also Angela Dean-Hart Hancock, who wrote a really cool book, and it's called Emergency Homiletics, I think. She picked up on that, like, Barth has this distinctive, like, and everything gets very much dramatic, and he's like, no, slow down. But also, as he's assigned, and this is in Bonn, to teach systematic theology, and like the colleagues who starts like Nazifying the university is the homiletics professor. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to teach homiletics now. And instead of like, making sermons that really try to grasp people emotionally, we're just going to read one passage of scripture after another and put ourselves in a very different space. So like, even as it feels wildly unpolitical, I think like that's a very distinctive example of kind of doing a counter politics, right? Of not giving in to this kind of emotional tides and even like trying to whip it up further. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that's maybe kitchen psychology. Like, I don't actually know all that much about psychology in terms of actual training and expertise, but like, I will, try and articulate what I feel. And I very quickly realize I'm thinking my feelings, right? And I'm trying to do that before I feel them. So, therapists and coaches will typically often advise us to locate them in our bodies first to see how they change, if we breathe differently and so forth, and to kind of insist on the feeling first before you start putting them into words and into reflection. I, being the like headspace person that I am, that's difficult for me, but I'm trying my best. I do also find that it is helpful to articulate, especially at the stage where you then can kind of also share with others. I find that to be the, like, in any kind of discernment process, the being able to either, to be able to work things with others and have a different take on them is crucial. Yeah, I mean, I do want to say with the emotions, right? I'm not sure we need to like chill them all the time, right? This is also, there's like, I mean, there's so much interesting research on the like different emotional and affective politics, and they can get the leverage for all kinds of good things, right? And we have a lot of cool affect theory that also especially asks us and helps us attune more closely to how also all kinds of supposedly bad emotions actually like point us to where things are really wrong. And that's really important to like not, there's a history there, for example, right? Not just of the think tanks, but of the field tanks, to say that actually helps us to also really pinpoint like what is wrong with capitalism and like the racialized system in which we live and all kinds of heteronormative constraints. Like maybe we need to tend to some of that affect that it generates that will allow us to tap into a different register than trying to fight it on the policy level, or maybe we will never get to the policy level if we don't lean into this affect first. But so it's a bit of a both and you'll find that both and quite pronounced in many portions of the book. In some ways, I'm also existentially a dialectic thinker, I think. But to say, right, like rage can be such a powerful emotion also for like movements of solidarity and outrage over injustice and then like actually doing something about it. At the same time, pausing and saying, right, like if you get the feeling that in this political climate, people are like, there's an interest in you being afraid. There's an interest in you being angry. There's an interest in that. Like, at least, pause and ask who it benefits.
One of the threads, right, that moves through part one, thinking about, preparing yourself, that, you have a section on, Jesus weeping about feeling your feelings. Right after the next one is, well, now test your feelings, deprive them of your pathos. There are these different moves, but like collectively, they're kind of invitations. I mean, they're hermeneutical invitations. They're different ways of reading the moment. And by putting them all together, as opposed to a theologian maybe performing one mode, you have them all there and invite people over a week to try each mode, right? And so there's like a collective process. Like there's like the feeling one, and then it's like now test it, and then like do your confession and recommit. Then you move to finding purpose. There's the one of the gifts I think of the book in each part, and as they work together and in each section, is that each of the day's reflection kind of sets at a particular angle or particular slant the moment. And as you move through the book, there's here's the ways in which we gather, the different slants in which grace tones us to the moment. And then when you get done doing that, it's like, now what does listening look like? Oh, let me think about the power of language at the front. Oh, but what happens when we look from the perspective of below or from the weak? Oh, what happens when we choose to stand firm and not give up space? Oh, what happens when we see our privilege in this and do it? Like, if you just took the outline of the book, it says something about what happens when we're formed by the kind of multiple vocalities or perspectives of the gospel in any one of these postures. And I found it completely compelling. That is not even a question, Tripp. That was mostly just like why Tripp likes it and told his friends they should read it.
Well, I love it.
Generally leads to awkward interviews.
On one reader, right? But that's the idea. I intentionally, and I mean, there was a part of me that was like, oh, let's analyze the political moment and let's do like a theological, treatise on it. And I really tried to resist that urge. And so you will find right, like, I hope, or almost virtually like analysis of what is going on or attempt to explain stuff or what you should think, and more of like but these feel like here are salient passages from scripture actually, and here are some key figures that like if we think through this moment together, if we feel through it together, and if we walk through it along this kind of almost liturgical devotional path, then everyone can like do their own process. Like I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything in particular. This invitation of doing this together and hopefully coming out, slightly strengthened on the other side.
So one of the things that kind of runs through it as well is the power of doing this in community, or the gift of the tradition and these kinds of things. You even have a section on the need to be a conservative on occasion. So when you're thinking of the ways in which your students and the people around you come to you where the palpable tension and energy of a crisis is before them, where do you begin to go, well, it might be time to get more conservative, to get more grounded, to return to the tradition? What does that invitation look like, and what's the promise of it?
Yeah, thanks. So I hope it's not a like, let's return to the tradition because now everything is bad type of move. And the lesson that you mentioned about being conservative, it has the double message of like, be more radical and be more conservative. And sometimes this can be the same thing. And I think that's more of the point, right? So one of the things is that if we live in a moment where actually, people are moving fast and breaking things, and not just the bros in Silicon Valley, but now also like people are intentionally trying to break down a political system and a division of powers and institutions that used to like that are flawed in all the ways. And at the same time, right, at this moment, to be aware of like, oh yeah, but institutional, like whether certain constitutional provisions or division of separation of powers or like universities, media, free press, right? Like these institutions, they are hugely valuable. If we just break them and they go away, nothing's going to be better. And to kind of say, right, rather than, I mean, I'm sometimes saying only half jokingly, and like I wish in this moment we had more actual conservatives, right? I kind of feel I want some good conservatives that like, the value kinds, which like I then will, try to debate them all day long on any of their values. But yeah, anyways, to say, right, like sometimes the most radical thing to do could be to try and preserve certain things that make a future possible and that make a communal process possible. And sometimes, yeah, and I don't want to think of it as like tradition in the sense of like, whatever happened in the past is more authoritative or whatever. But in kind of this moment of tumult and of feeling loss, to get this opening up of the vision of like, we're not alone. Other people are experiencing this too. This is both true for those around us, and this is true for other people in other places and times. And so it's kind of a call to expand our vision and tap into that solidarity. First of all, that the body of Christ provides, right? There are Christians right here, right now around us that we have something in common with. And I'm not saying we should only, ally with Christians. I don't care about that. But like, look who is also there internationally, right? The church is such a huge network around the globe. This is also one of the very interesting things I think about, in the Third Reich, as flawed as like all of the ecumenical movement was, and as much as it was also bound up with all kinds of colonial and missional and whatever other kinds of histories. It was also one of the things that did provide international networks to smuggle people out of the country when push came to shove. Like or that paid attention to what was happening because there was some sort of standing partnership and so forth. So, and then to say, yes, and then in the past, right? Because we don't have access to future wisdom, but we do have access to some extent to histories that have come before us, and to say, at least, I mean, yeah, Timothy Snyder opens his On Tyranny with, I think, history does not repeat, but it does instruct, right? To say, insofar as there's something similar in that moment, why not tap into the wisdom that people have come up with in those other moments? And to think of tradition as this, right? Like this wider cloud of witnesses, rather than whatever, a kind of authoritative thing that we should just need to grasp and perform and then everything will be fine. I don't think that is how it works. Not all past wisdom will be equally applicable, and some stuff will have to actively be reworked, and some things might also get lost, right? That keeps being true. But just to say, we're not alone in this moment. There's like others around us before us, and we can connect to them.
I thought there's a real similarity between how the tradition functioned in the book and how it functions for Gadamer, like in the sense that like a tradition simultaneously a gift and a burden. But one of the gifts is it actually gives you narratives, frameworks, and languages for questioning it. And yet you can't question the whole thing at the whole time. You have to leverage parts of it. So you have to conserve wisely to challenge a tradition itself. And I think one of the things you see in times of where there's intense pressure is like when there's the recognition that we need something different, people want to invent a whole new vocabulary. And so we end up cutting ourselves off from resources. And so like even framing it right in the book, in the movement of the liturgy, and then having kind of a multivalent take on each of those movements is a It's seeing the tradition as a generative space for working against itself and for itself at the same time.
Yeah, and I can frame this in a different idiom, right? I mean, this is something we can learn from queer theory and not just from like conservative
Yeah, have you ever
theology to
written that in
say,
a book?
so to say, right, like a scavenger methodology consists in like taking the pieces that are there and doing something with them. You never start from scratch. You don't have to. Sometimes there's a temptation to, right? Like it's so complicated. We want to make tabula rasa. We want to start over. That's actually one of the most violent acts that there is. And also it never works, right? It never works. It just creates trauma. Yeah. But yeah, look, the pieces and the planks and see what we can build with it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure when God tried to start over, it involved mass genocide, so we shouldn't do it.
Yep. That's
that was an arc reference for people that haven't read the Bible recently. So, okay, one of the things in part 2, which is the listening, responding, the hearing the word section, you begin by dwelling on the power of words in general.
Mhm.
And you say, even our small human words make and destroy worlds. And that gets applied both to what the gift of words for people of faith, but also a key for understanding how an authoritarian regime can use language to dehumanize or prepare for violent action and that kind of thing. So as a people who are called into being by the word, what do we learn about attending to words that can help us in trying to discern the moment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a scholar I draw on here, Victor Tempera, who was actually a Jewish linguist in the Third Reich, who wrote a whole treatise on the language of the Third Reich and kind of just chronicled how it shifted and changed. And since there have been many other studies on, I mean, this was also not the first one, but it was a very salient one. And he, for example, noticed how some of the greatest acts of violence got hidden by very technocratic and bureaucratic language, but also how they were prepared, for example, by starting to use dehumanizing language for certain people groups. In his context, obviously, mostly the Jews, where once you start comparing people to animals or to inanimate objects, or not just comparing them, but actually using, these terms for them, you also deprive those with whom you talk of empathy for them. And actually, that works, right? And when later such terms like genocide got formalized, and scholars started coming up with what actually has to happen so that something like a genocide becomes possible. One of the steps they noted was also that language deteriorates to create precisely a situation where empathy gets for certain people groups gets weakened. And I think so. Dehumanization by language, I think, is stage 4 of 10 on the scale to genocide. And I remember just a couple of years ago, and this was very shortly after the atrocious attacks of Hamas on October 7th. I had a student who went in and just looked at news articles of how deaths and casualties on both sides after Israel started retaliating in Gaza were reported. And when would people language be used for one group? And when would the language be slightly more formal or even, depersonalized? And to kind of just chronicle how that was happening even very quickly after October 7 in Israeli and media, and then also in international media. So, and we have this at a certain level here, right? Like when we start comparing immigrants to floods, or when we talk about when we pathologize certain gender and sexualities, when we use language of illness, right, for certain choices that people make or certain ways that they live, or compare whole people groups to animals. Like we can see some of that happening, or even just the rhetoric that gets used against political enemies as well. So I think these are things to like pay attention to and to be really concerned about. Yeah, was that what you were looking for, or were something?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I there's like the observation of how the harnessing of language, can pervert how we see, relate, and interpret the material lives of the other. And that's like in stark contrast to the word of God that addresses each and every person as the divine image and the beloved, right? Like, so to me, one of the things that's really helpful there, right, is you, after thinking about the power of the word in that same section in part 2, is where you go, okay, if we're attending to that, then where do we show up? And you go, stand where God stands. And there you look at the poem from Bonhoeffer where he talks about Christians standing by God in God's grief the same language he uses when he thinks about Gethsemane, right? Like, in what is faithful witness in this time? He's like, I'm not even going to suggest a solution, but like, it's like Christ is looking at the church going, well, couldn't you at least stay awake and pray with me for 2 or 3 hours? Like, I'm just asking that. I'm not asking you to do X, Y, or Z, but you can't even sit there and pray. And so I wonder, when you're thinking about, like, what does belief in God mean if it's a commitment to stand where God stands? And how do we start to think about that in this moment? Because if we're thinking of words that can generate a solution to everything, then our dreams are outstripped by our agency. But where we stand says something about what it looks like for us to be responsible, because we get to stand where we move to. And so a lot of that invitation is both Christologically centered, but it's also empowering, I think, for the disciple. Christologically centered, but it's also empowering, I think, for the disciple. Our energy.
Yes. Yeah. And both, right? Like, to be strategic about where we put our attention and where we, like, physically put our bodies, and where we put our energy, so that there we can make slightly more of a difference, right? So with the power of the word, I think there's also an important first bit of, as people who get spoken into being, to also attend to the power that we have to make space for others, and to, in a time where rhetoric degenerates so quickly into polemics, right? To make sure the way we talk makes the world we want to live in possible. And so, right, I think of language similarly, also as a kind of space making. And then the stand where God stands is first and foremost this call to attention, right? It's not even a call to action to do something specific, as you rightly described, but first of all, to, like, keep your attention on the site where, like, the disciples fled and you want to run away, but, like, where it gets hard. And we can also, again, put this in different terms. I really liked Anna Reichel staying with the trouble, but I really liked this idea of, if kind of under the cross, like, if the cross is where God initially finds us and where we find God, then let's hang out there, right? Let's hang out where it's hard, and maybe even where people get crucified. So first of all, be witnesses, to offer solace and companionship, and to, like, not let this part of the world just dip behind the radar or under the radar. But then also, right, to maybe there start practicing some corporeal politics, right? Like, what changes if there are witnesses? What changes if there are people there where bad things happen? What difference might that make? And
So in that section, I think there are 3 different times you bring up vicarious, like vicarious suffering or vicarious representative action, or depending on, I guess it depends on which translation people use of Bonhoeffer, but and that's a concept he uses initially in a Christological context, then in an ethical context, like, and then an ecclesiastical one. And so, like, it's one of those ideas, that, like, stuck in his head, and as he's trying to think of different situations, as the church situation changed, the same kind of concept shows up, and it shows up at different points here for you. So I'm interested in just maybe what occasioned it, as, like, of all the things to go wrestling with in Bonhoeffer and trying to think about these moments, the vicarious representative action became a place, right? First, when you're talking about the story of Maximilian Kolbe, I think it shows up there. Later, you bring it up, like, after you're talking about Vignani and some of the others that were close to him, that were closer into the conspiracy and thinking about privilege, the question of, like, giving up space. It becomes a concept that has multiple uses, and all of them resonated with me in the way Bonhoeffer uses it. So mostly it's just a softball talk about Bonhoeffer, vicarious representative action, and such.
Maybe you should talk more about Bonhoeffer vicarious action. But I can tell you 2 bits that really assisted me. I mean, one is this, and I get that the kind of the mutual representing that happens. This is the priestly office, right? This is where Christ stands in as God for us, and stands in for humanity in front of God, and stands in for God in front of humanity, and also becomes this mediating figure and meeting points. And in some sense, that is not our office, right? It doesn't have to be our office. That place is already taken, or that bridge is already built. But there's this ethical sense that also maybe Dorothy Zeller, like, God has no hands but our hands. Like, there is a call to be that presence of God for the other, But what I really, really, really find very interesting in Bonhoeffer is that it never gets this romanticized version of, right, like just do what Jesus would do, or yeah, because it's so deeply steeped into this. For him, this scene of the cross is deeply steeped in guilt and in sin, right? Like it is actually not this pristine heroic moment where of altruism or self-sacrifice or a righteous cause or whatever, but it's actually, and he grapples with that, right, in his own ethical discernment. It is a moment of becoming guilty, not just standing in the place of guilt, but assuming guilt and having like this whole idea that every responsibly acting person becomes guilty to some extent. And I think we feel, and we, regardless of the way that Bonhoeffer easily also gets made into a kind of both martyr and saint figure, but also invites us into this reflection that, I mean, we're part of a system where we're complicit all the time with everything. And that can also completely paralyze us. And I mean, not that we should shrug it off lightly, right? But at the same time, it cannot keep us from acting and having to act decisively for others at crucial moments. And to even come to the conclusion that some sort of personal holiness and like trying to stay pure, trying to preserve your integrity can be the temptation. It can be a temptation. And it can lead Christians in particular to withdraw and to kind of cultivate our own kind of space and like the bad and evil world out there. And to say like that's really not the option here. That's what at least the vicarious representative action for me also, like this is a note that I always want to have in there. It's not just the heroic sacrificing yourself for the other. It's just you have to be in history and part of a world that will always, there will be no pure choices.
Yeah, and one of the things that has became intense in a different way in Berlin with a whole bunch of clergy is, it's one thing for scholars wrestling with these different figures. Oh, I was reading Hanna Reichel and Bonhoeffer and Barth and thinking about this, and that. And then to be reading it, sitting in its house, and then there's clergy who are like, well, what do we do with ICE raids taking place next to our church? Or the refugee families that we care for? And they start inserting, right, the kinds of stories that add all the complexity and urgency that you hear when we went to like the Confessing Church the Confessing Church Museum at the Niemöller House, and where you hear his story on the Helmut Gollwitzer and the complications even in that church, right? It's messy and complicated, and there are all these different things. Yeah. And, you had this moment of like all the clergy going, oh, okay, it was even complicated for them, and there's complicity, and you're trying to negotiate it, and you're trying to figure this out, and then you have all the different push and pull of the different members of the congregation, but you also have the growing clarity and awareness of what you're dealing with, and then what do you do? The third part of your book, which is looking broadly at communion, or what we become, what we've received, has all these vignettes, each of the sections on that pause on the power of reception, of what happens in the act of community. From what does prayer look without ceasing, both for the individual, and what does it mean to be a community of prayer? What does it mean to lean into joy when joy is something that you feel like you have to steal and perhaps hide, all the way down to like thinking about just, the Eucharist specifically itself. And I wonder, Andy Root and I, when we were talking about what we were going in doing, and then the moment we asked everyone we got there, what question do you carry with you? All the questions were specific down to the individual's life. For those that came like, I don't know what I'm making my faith right now, I'm coming, to then clergy, and it's specific questions about the life of their congregation. And to me, one of the gifts of the book is, yes, you can do it, but you can do it in community, and it's something that points you back into thinking about all these questions of faith in this moment with other people, and making space for all the complexities that are there so that you actually get kind of more passionate clarity in what you do together. How does this, especially knowing you wrote this thinking of students coming to ask you these questions, like, so what do we do with these things you've taught us, Hanna? What does the role or gift of community look like when in our particular moment? Like what perhaps are we skipping or moving by?
And I love the quotes, become what you have received. And I first heard this in a Eucharistic context, right? So it was sending out after communion and then being like, become what you have received, body of Christ. That was the affirmation and the word of sending that we received. And that really stuck with me. And I think, I mean, now the way that you talked about it, it makes a lot of sense also for like other forms of our formation, right? Education, tradition, and here this idea of cultivating a politics of joy, which is something different than just like, whatever self-care practices, which is no shade, can also be very important. But right, as this kind of communal practice of creating a life that is rich and that is not reducible to just suffering, oppression, or even the important activism, right? That might be on the agenda, but that is deeper and wider and then has its own force, because this is now why you protect it. And this is now what also gives you a certain ground from which then to do stuff and a resource and an internal strength. So to not get consumed in that struggle of oh, this is breaking down, and here we have to do something, which remains true, right? But yeah, I think we need space, we need community for all the things. I mean, we need it for discernment, we need it for effective action, but it's also, this is just life, right? That we then protect, right? This is us being with others as relational creatures with stories and songs and meals and prayer and quibbles and all the things, right? Because, and this is, I think, the other, and you see kind of also kind of a certain theological through line here, but this is the other thing, right? The body of Christ is also not a romantic community. It is a broken body. This is something that also we lift up in the Eucharist and kind of dramatize it, right? It's a broken body that we consume, and we're also a broken body. It just starts with the first communion of disciples, where you have the traitor dipping his hand in the same bowl and probably thinking he was a faithful disciple as he betrays Christ. And then even that becomes part of the story, right? And so, yeah. What was the question?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. I'll just yes. The community bit. There was one other section in the community thing that I wanted to ask you about, because in the chapter on pray without ceasing, you distinguish between solitude and loneliness, and how solitude is something that's kind of essential for the spiritual life, and then you spend time thinking about what that looks like in an age of mass media, social media, surveillance, and such. And I know you've written on surveillance quite a bit, which seems to be becoming a more pressing challenge. So when you think of that invitation to pray without ceasing and the increasing kind of precognitive orientation that the individual receives because of algorithmic mediation and our use of screens and what we see and all that kind of stuff, what is it like to take seriously the invitation to pray without ceasing, as one is aware of just what surveillance capitalism is doing with our interiority?
Yeah. So yeah, the distinction between solitude and loneliness, I think, is from Hannah Arendt, but I think like Bonhoeffer has a very similar one as well, right? So, and in some ways, that age also is the first age of mass media, and where mass media get harnessed politically and propaganda machines, but very different from our social media culture today, where the mass media at that time was kind of unidirectional, right? Like you now have the first voice in every living room, and then maybe there, in certain authoritarian regimes, right, you also, or in most of them, you get some sort of secret police and some sort of also spying on one another. But like that is definitely at a different level now. But now we also have this first, even before it's a question of surveillance, it's also this question of attention economy and complete like frazzlement. And so, yeah. And so this chapter is written around prayer, and I've received a question of like, is it actual prayer? Are you actually interested here in a conversation with God? Because in some ways I frame it around this question of interiority. But I do think this is something that gets lost, and it's something that is fiercely cultivated by ancient prayer practice, to say, right? Like, before you can be in the world, or in order to be in the world, you need to be able to be alone with yourself. And to be able to be alone with yourself, you actually practice that by being with someone else. But you don't and some of us can also maybe get a sense of that in some really well functioning relationships, intimate relationships. But maybe the first and primary relationship in which we can really cultivate that is the one with God, where we have an other that is a true other. And at the same time, we can really be ourselves. And that can be scary, and that can be an area, and a space in which we grow. But this is maybe also a space where we can develop that ability, right? As we kind of hope, those of us who have some sort of measure that we trust God, and this is a space that we can open up, then this can also radiate out into becoming a space that is where we can be with ourselves, with others in other spaces. And so then that can also issue into a life of prayer, and that can be an active life, that can be a contemplative life at the same time. But that is not frazzled in the same way, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. How has the kind of increasing surveillance and management of our fears and anxieties that a few very large companies who spent millions of dollars to sit behind the president as he was inaugurated, controlling more and more of our lives, holding our attention by our fears and resentments and lack. How do you see that theologically? Because to me, it seems something rather significant that plays an increasing role in how one holds attention, right? And the entire movement of these devotionals is following how the liturgy teaches us to hold our attention. And it seems far amiss from the way in which algorithms manage to hold our attention.
Yeah, I think it's a different kind of attention, and it generates maybe also a different kind of subjectivity, right? So because I think that's another counterpoint of the surveillance and social media culture, is the kind of maximization of readability of the self, right? We produce ourselves in a certain way always for a viewer and a reader. So one is, how much attention, how much focus do we actually have, and how much do we get just, are we always in the feed and in the scroll? But also, what kind of subject do we become if all our communications and even the way that we perceive others are always run through all these, the algorithmic maximization of readability? This is another area where I think it's very interesting to also learn from queer and trans cultures, right? Like, where there's a lot of thinking about, do we actually have to be legible to others, and why is that? And why is it both absolutely necessary in order to be with others at all? And then also, there should be a limit to that. And so I think, here some theological wisdom and wisdom from different communities, and then of this political moment, also comes together to say it is acutely necessary that we protect privacy, that we protect spaces of interiority, both in terms of information, but also even in terms of selfhood, right?
One of the things that, spending quite a bit of time, my son took his best friend with us on our trip to Germany, and getting to spend time with them talking about their process of coming of age, and is the things as parents that we go, I'm not sure how this is helping them, right? Like smartphone and all that kind of stuff. The things my parents complained about, I defended them. Where I'm like, no, I mean, MTV is great. I mean, all it does is show music. And there was a time that happened. And yet the things that I'm worried about for them, they agree with. Mm-hmm. And so and the biggest one was just how, they to opt out of all the engagement that takes place on a smartphone is social death. And they're very aware of how their selfhood is manipulated and turned inward in perverse ways by it. And we were talking about it, and you get to this point where my oldest is like, yeah, at some point, people thought it was dumb to have a smoking section at high school because it's just not good. There's not an answer of why you should have breaks to smoke cigarettes at high school. But it wasn't the kids that said, hey, can we quit smoking cigarettes? The adults thought, this is bad. We should just not do this. So y'all should get around to doing it, for handing out technology, where now we all run around feeling the need to start getting in some rat race and out competing our friends and how we look and blah, blah, blah. And he just goes through this whole thing. And it brought up that tension, I think, of of what happens when you're looking at things that are threatening the fabric of social well-being and flourishing, and then thinking, what am I supposed to do about it? Like, he's sitting there and his friend are like, yeah, well, aren't y'all supposed to do something about this? You're the adults. And that the impact of it is undermining a lot of what, at least for most of our species history, took place in the formation of self, of like moments of friction, be it with text or with people or the self. It required a kind of attention of relating to a person or a text or a community or someone else's face. And now that the more friction that shows up there, the more we'd rather be fascinated in something that knows our desires and our pains, and we can just swipe along and go through. And it was interesting to hear teenagers go, this is really bad for me, and I don't know how to opt out. We should have rules around it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it seems to be that is a prevalent, like there are surveys, right? Like polls that actually say this generation is aware of that. And they would rather, I forget the statistics, but basically, right? Like of today's youth saying it's the internet, even just the internet, like, which is really, not quite yet even social media or whatever. Is it predominantly good or bad? Or would we rather it was invented or not? And they say, no, we'd rather it was never invented. Yeah, I think, one of the things about the responsibilities of adults, but yeah, are we so much smarter? But two things, right, that are really relevant here. One is kind of the loneliness that it creates, and which feeds again into all kinds of the types of emotions that get so easily abused and leveraged by authoritarian, and also like just movements that leverage hostility. Because if you become isolated, if you don't have real life other people, that's a fertile ground for resentment and also for lack of empathy, right? It's like, but the other portion, which is also so important, and you named it, like the friction that we need for any type of politics, the ability to negotiate with one another. Yeah, so that's very disconcerting. And in the sense, let's like advertise the smoking room here. Like in some sense, right? That's a way better formational ground for a political space, and it often was. I don't know, at my high school, at least, like there would have, we don't need maybe to bring back cigarettes, but it did engender spaces where people would gather. They would sit outside if there was no smoker room. That's actually healthy. And they would have a conversation with strangers. They would share resources. If you didn't have one, you bum one off the other, and so forth. Like that feels like a, politically speaking, better formational space than the smartphone economy, socially and theologically.
Well, yeah, well, as someone who works twice a week at a cigar lounge, I'm perfectly comfortable embracing certain things. What's been the response to students who provoke this book out of you reading it?
My response to them, their response to me?
Yeah, what's been there, like, for students that were asking what do we do with this? And then you're like, well, how about I give you a month of devotionals?
I don't know yet. We'll see. Well, some of the students that pressed me, they were actually part of the journey. So, one of the first things that I did was actually, and graciously, I got invited to talk to them. And I was like, I don't even know if I have anything to say, but let's try this. And I would like for you to think together with me. And some of the lessons actually kind of emerged from further conversations with students who were like, this is something that comes up for me. Several of the lessons are in here because, and some of them are now also colleagues and, they're grown up people who graciously thought together with me about, because certain things came to my mind. And then for it to really round out into the structure and both the form and the content is very much due to some of them. And then for everyone else, well, I guess we'll see.
What kind of advice do you have for clergy trying to negotiate what clarity looks like in a moment like this, right? Like especially when you are tasked, as a minister of the gospel and in a congregation that's politically divergent.
Yeah.
Most, especially like mainline Protestant clergy are just as likely to vote socialist as vote Republican. But the congregations themselves, only the Episcopal Church and the UCC had a majority vote for Kamala Harris. So the congregations and the mainline congregations of, students end up going to Princeton and those kind of places are very politically mixed. And so I wonder, what is it like to have integrity, be clear, and practice what you talk about towards the end of the book, kind of Barth's advice to embrace the unpleasant ones and the guilty and complicit.
Well, so he said that after they lost, right?
Uh-huh.
So that's also a very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I do advocate for like we should reach out beyond our comfort zone, but also we need to, especially if you're in a position of leadership, you also have a responsibility of like keeping those entrusted to your care safe. But yeah, even in the best of time, I think the clergy position can be one of the most extreme, most extremely lonely positions, right? Because you have, on the one hand, you share so much with your congregation and you are there for them in very intimate ways. And at the same time, you cannot be there in the same way as your congregants. So, I mean, my advice here, first and foremost, would also be like seek community, but not just with your congregants, right? Like find others who are in similar positions, have your own support groups, have your own, find your networks where you can strengthen one another. I think would be so that you can build, like, have your prayer life, you have your solitude there, you have your own other clergy support group or other activists or whoever is kind of the relevant peer group for you, because you can't give all and be all to your congregation at all times, and making these discernment questions of like what and who to be in that context can be really difficult and be very lonely. So make it, have others to make it with you, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the difficult things, especially thinking that, whatever was revealed in Trump's first time in the White House and since then did not generate any kind of preaching or leadership or clarity, where voting for him again this time or the time before or 3 times meant you still, half the people in mainline churches felt comfortable voting for Trump and being, active, regular attending and giving members.
Yeah.
Right. And so like it seems to be that there's something about addressing these bigger structural type challenges to justice that was like that part of the church's voice was already impotent or mute in some way, right? For for such a majority of the church to not even think about it, let alone to do it again, right? So it wasn't like you saw after the first time Trump was in office, then in 2020 and then again in the last election, there was some like decreasing voting for him among our students and mainline Protestant churches. And so most of them, when I tell them what I do, they're like, yeah, I'd get fired if I had your tactic. That's what my advice is usually like. That's how I lose my job. And I was like, well, you don't think you lose your job by just cutting half the gospel out?
Yeah, or you lose your soul. I mean, I think this is really very, very difficult. I don't know that there is kind of a generic advice in that situation. I like to here again also lean on the metaphor of the body of Christ, right? Of saying there are many members and they can have different functions. And it might be that some can be more exposed than others and called to prophetic witness and or like to radical shit. And some will be in spaces where they like deeply compromised and actively, stay in relationships where you're like, how can you, talk to these people? And it is crucially important that some of us do that. I think that is both is actually very needed. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I take also from the history of the confessing church is some of the people who, in hindsight were like, we think of as heroes were those who stayed in spaces that were deeply compromised. So who worked for the Ministry of Justice or who like worked in a church that was actually, co-opted or even in concentration camps, right? Like how, I don't, and I don't want to like advise anyone to stay in a space that they feel like, it creates too much cognitive dissonance and actual guilt for them. Like, no. And at the same time, right, like the historic experience shows that even and especially in the places that get really fucked up, it will be so important that there are some who don't just follow orders and who, retain a modicum of humanity and extend it to others. So that's the one thing to kind of say, especially if especially we're not just moving into an authoritarian, but a kind of totalitarian phase, then this can be actually maybe one of the comforting things to say, there's not going to be an uncompromised space, right? They will want total allegiance in all the spaces. And this means wherever you are, there's some room for making a difference because it will matter in any space. The other thing that's like, I mean, again, right, I think there is also a temptation, and one that is very well founded, but it can be a temptation to withdraw. And that's also like theologically or from activism, like any space that you see it, you will not gain it back. Any relationship that you give up, you will not be able to influence anymore. And a lot of the changing of minds happens actually in close relationships, right? If there's something that changes people's minds, it is them coming up and going like, "Hey, we won, Trump won." And you go like, "What do you mean? Your son is gay. Like, why do you say that?" And then they go, "Oh, yeah, but at least they're doing something against the immigrants." And you're like, "Well, but I'm an immigrant." "Oh, yeah, but you're not." Like, so like, that's very uncomfortable. It might even be unsafe. I'm not saying like anyone should be there, right? But if none of these exchanges happen, then that's also a kind of giving up. And so, yeah, I don't think there is like a one right choice for everyone here. But I take some comfort in thinking, actually, and maybe this is all. I'm also always showing implicitly my loser colors. This. It's like wherever God puts you, there's something you can do there, right? And if you're surrounded by assholes, there's something you can do there. Changing diapers
Get
can
toilet
be
paper. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when a lot of times we're just like in the book, you're pointing out all the challenges of both understanding what's going on around you, and then how you talk about it, and then how you relate to it. And we look back at what happened in Germany with this like view from Auschwitz, right, where we're like, oh, well, now we know what's going on. But in the middle of it, there was so much complexity of both what you knew and when you knew, how you were connected, and what you did with your agency, and then how you described it and what resistance looked like. What is it like to recognize all the complexity that's there and the need for discernment, but also to not easily give in to the most compromised or passable solutions? Because oftentimes in congregations or by leaders in political areas, you're trying to find the language that is least confrontational, that signals some value, rather than clarity, at least as Christians, as one who has chosen solidarity with the crucified people.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, maybe this allowed me to clarify something for myself that I've been conflicted about, because I've been hearing myself say a lot about the like, we need to stay with the discomfort and in the and not withdraw into spaces of purity and holiness and whatever. And I think what I mean, or what I think of as like kind of the more hopeful route, is not the like lowest common denominator, right? Like we have to compromise, we have to talk with people that we maybe don't see eye to eye in many things, and so we'll end up with a minimal consensus of like what is it that we can say sharedly. I think of it as the opposite. I think that's the community that's sticking around with one another is all about creating friction and retaining some of that friction instead of avoiding it. And I think part of what is disconcerting in this whole political slide that we're seeing is, even as it gets ever more aggressive and maybe also violent in some areas, it actually isn't all set on eliminating friction, right? Different people that think differently, people that criticize, people that also look and live differently or whatever. But so to instead invest in the kind of community that means we retain the friction, or we even, and as a minimal act of resistance, like we create friction, right? They're not going along. I mean, this is also, and you had, I think, Victoria Barnett on the show on like bystanders, right? Like this is one of the crucial insights. And like when things get really bad, the most important difference is not between perpetrators and victims. The most important difference is between the bystanders, like those who did not act, is what enables the worst thing to happen. And not to say that there aren't strong degrees of guilt and also victimhood, but kind of what matters for the discernment is kind of the question: what can I do to disrupt what is happening? What can I do to create openings for something else, rather than how much either, it could be another leading question than the kind of either positive vision or the full uncompromising stance.
Yeah. The Overton window was the word I was looking for.
Now we know.
It's the poli-sci term for the of policies that are considered acceptable, right? And it was like 3 or 4 weeks ago where the Overton window slid enough that mainstream Democrats decided it was like 2 years of intentional starvation, and now we can talk about it.
Now we can talk about genocide, yes.
Yeah. I would say one of the things that I've, at least when I worked full time in a congregation for 15 years, like through graduate school and a little time after it, and I found like when you're trying to raise awareness for something and you're aware that different people in the congregation will hear the voicing of it as partisan condemnation, oftentimes it is best to put it in the prayer of confession, because then everyone is acknowledging what's going on in a shared act of complicity. And if you're putting it in the context where both telling the truth, before or in a context of grace, then opens up a space where collectively we're responding out of it. And confession, oftentimes prayers of confession have the ability to be specific, but it's specific in a way that is experienced different than when, you happen to be the ordained one exegeting the text in front of everyone. And they're like, oh, hey, who's surprised that our Bernie Bro preacher said this?
Yeah. And I mean, it's also, I think, sometimes we get hung up on like the question of the terminology, and that is sometimes really important. At the same time, I think language can have different functions in different contexts, right? Sometimes the terms are about signaling, right? And then this is, right? Like by using that term, you basically tell people I'm standing here rather than there. Sometimes that is crucially important. Sometimes you're in a communicative setting where you're actually trying to convince, or you're trying to explain, or you're trying to communicate. And then sometimes like that, these like certain, the words that now already like signal specific things are actually less helpful and maybe less important. I'm not saying that we should, avoid words that might be perceived as problematic, but I think it does depend on the content, right? Like, what are we trying to do? Is it, am I speaking ex cathedra? Am I articulating in a confession? Am I sitting at coffee hour and trying to explain my concern for starving children? Yeah.
So how did writing, the whole process of writing this kind of devotional, how did it change your own spiritual life? Did you find different practices more helpful? Did it make you pay attention to something differently than you had before? Did it change the way prayer functioned or how you show up in worship? Like what was the formative part for you writing a guide of spiritual formation in chaotic times?
I think it did slow me down, which that helped me a lot. And it gave me a different kind of rhythm to process. And it did give me both more of my own prayer space, but also reconnect me with stuff that I'd read and people in a different way. And so that became really enriching for me. So in that sense, I think, it worked. It checked all this is what maybe a spiritual life should do. Like I read more scripture and more other things, and I talked more to God and more to other people at the end of it. And even now, it keeps now generating this rhythm, because now I have to post snippets of it, or I have to talk with people about it. And there might be book clubs who go through it in a certain pattern. So I'm like, this is so interesting, because I mean, there are seasons, right? I've gone through seasons of intense, different kinds of spiritual practice, and there's a version of me that would have become a monk in a different life. This is not very close to it, but it's been really interesting.
The number of theologians who will squeeze in, and there's a version of me that would have become a monk at some point, is significant. And that, yeah, I could think of quite a few. Or the number that have been a monk at some point.
Yeah.
Is, the one time I was doing, I think it was an AAR thing, one of the podcasts we did there, and Jack Caputo and John Dominic Crossan were both on, and they made the joke. They were like, when Tripp You may think he sounds the most Christian, but he's the only one that's never even taken vows.
Is that true?
And I was like, well, not that I've never been brother anything. Well, except in the sense that there are certain churches I've gone to where every male in the room is brother. But yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah, thank you.